Hi, welcome everyone. I guess you've been welcomed already. It's great to be here and great to meet you, Mariana, and to talk about your wonderful and very personal book. I'm just meeting you, so I was hoping I could start before we get to the book by asking you to say a bit about how you came to philosophy in the first place and how it became part of your life.
All right, thank you. I'm so happy to see 115 people here. This is
It's
really
amazing.
cool. So thank you all for coming, and I hope that something we talk about resonates with you. Um, how I came to philosophy, good teachers. I think that's the story behind a lot of people's introduction to philosophy. I think for me, my parents were doctors, and so I knew I was not going to go into medicine at all.
Uh-huh.
But my mother always had a passion for philosophy. She's always, she would study Aquinas. And I think I read some Plato for fun in high school. We just had it around. We had Aristotle around and they would talk about it. My sister was maybe she minored in philosophy. So I knew the word philosophy. I thought I was going to go into psychology. But then I took a class. I really am so thankful for universities that force students to take a class in philosophy, because otherwise we don't get exposed to it and we don't really know what it is. And so I just had a really good few philosophers who taught me, and then even in grad school. So I just fell in love with the existentialists. It's not a particularly unique story. I think it's kind of everyone's, a lot of people get in through existentialism, but the difference is that most people get out. And
Uh-huh.
I was talking to a fellow grad student. We had already graduated, a couple of years, after we graduated, and he said something like that he'd outgrown the existentialists or matured out of them. And I was like, oh, I don't know what that is. I don't know how you could possibly mature out of the fact that we're all sort of quaking on the inside, right? And trying just to get by day to day. So I feel right at home in the existentialist tradition, and, happy to just sort of spend my life with them.
So it sounds like the kind of personal engagement, your own life was sort of invested in and kind of part of this from the beginning, because the book it sort of you talk about aspects of your life very frankly, and hopefully we'll get to some of them. But was that true all along, that philosophy was never disengaged for you from your own life? You never had to sort of bring the two back together?
Not really. And I think, and I didn't know anything about in college. I had never heard of the analytic continental split. So I wasn't sort of already groomed to be a certain kind of philosopher. I knew that I liked the history of philosophy. I knew I liked the ideas. I knew that they were personal. The ideas that I gravitated toward most were the personal ones. And I think we're going to talk about that later in conjunction with your work, temperamentally disposed to it, so it always felt relevant. And this is what my students tell me, which, I'm happy about, because it means that I think I'm doing a good job if they think it's relevant to their lives, right? Because, well, I teach in South Texas. It's 90% first gen, 90% Hispanic. Gloria Anzaldúa comes from here, and she says, we were never supposed to write, right? No one expects philosophy to come from South Texas, So I like it when my students are like, oh, of course this is relevant to my life, not some pie in the sky kind of ivory tower stuff, but no, we're dealing with questions of living and suffering and how to get by. So yeah, I think it always felt sort of natural.
Well, maybe there's a way to transition there into the book, because your students, one of the ways in which you show up is as a teacher of your students, and your students show up, and that happens right at the beginning with teaching and in a way rethinking how to teach or how to interpret Plato's cave and that sort of parable of what philosophy is all about, of sort of moving into the light. So maybe I could ask you to say a bit about how that frames your project and sort of introduce the book and the idea of living with dark moods.
Yeah, it's kind of the reigning metaphor of the book. I was playing with other metaphors like magic. I almost wrote about magic, and I was like, I don't know anything about magic. Why would I write about that? And then I thought, oh yeah, the cave, this should belong to a philosopher, in the sense of we should be able to, I don't know, repopularize it or something. And so I just was thinking about the cave, and it's got such a beautiful tie-in to darkness and light, and just rereading the cave over and over and over again, I realized that what I took out of it as an undergrad, and then what I think most, I don't know if I could even say most people take out of it, is this idea that they were prisoners because they were in this dark cave, and they had the chains on, you know, the neck and the hands and the feet, and they couldn't see each other, and they're looking at a world of shadows, and they couldn't even turn around, right? And there was a little fire behind them, but then behind them, behind the fire, was like some other guys or people, and they were holding up puppets, and they were just parading the puppets around in order to fool the people, because what the people saw in front of them was the shadows of the puppets. And so I was just thought it was so curious that Plato never said anything about the puppeteers. So I always I'm trying to talk to my class about this, like, who are they? Why are they here? Are they also prisoners? Are like the second, you know, like kind of they've graduated to out of the seat and into they can be the ones projecting. Are they doing it on purpose or not? But anyway, we would never go over that as an undergrad, or the times I've learned it in class. We just learned, okay, the liberator comes, yanks your chains off, pulls you outside. It really hurts. You know, the prisoner then, Plato says, likes to look at the ground, because on the ground you see shadows, and the shadows reminded him of what was on the inside, and that felt good and that felt comfortable. And he liked to look at the lake because there were the reflections, right? So he was happier in the moonlight, and then gradually, you know, came to understand truth, like see real trees instead of shadows of trees, etc. And that's the project of enlightenment. And then from then on, right, like the cave represented ignorance, and the light represented some sort of wisdom or truth, that by which we could see truth. And so a lot of the ways that we tend to talk about light and dark, you know, can be traced all the way back to that. I'm not even sure that Plato meant that, but it kind of has taken off, you know, with the confluence of, you know, the Enlightenment project, right? Like lots of things in philosophy went that way, of that light, like the dark ages and ignorance and danger and all this kind of thing. And then religion adds into it, you know, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Like there's just so much that wants us to believe that light is better than darkness, and darkness is scary and dangerous and ignorant. So that's what I'm setting up. That's the intro for any of you who might be interested in reading the book. Like, how are we going to get night vision if we're constantly being shoved out into the light? So I'd like to give you, Kieran, would it be okay if I show?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to show you a little, share my screen with you. I guess someone will have to tell me if you can see it.
I can see it. I think you could put, yeah, there you go. Now it's full size. Okay.
So this really helps me figure out what I'm saying when I forget what I'm saying, or when I forget what I've written about, because sometimes when I talk to other people, it's like we live in different worlds. And this is the world that I live in. These are the kind of messages that I see on a daily basis. And I'm so happy that y'all are like international, because I'm curious as to how it is in other parts of the world. I'm certainly only writing from a US context, although I have seen it slip into Mexico. I've seen similar stuff in Mexico recently. But I don't know. I don't know if it's like this in the UK. I don't know if these things are like plastered all over your walls in, you know, the East and in Spain. But this makes me feel crazy. Like, so these things are sort of written, like I'm literally talking about posters. I'm talking about coffee mugs. I'm talking about pillows. Like I've seen rocks painted with this kind of stuff written on here. And so what I am sort of diagnosing is like a kind of intolerance of darkness. Like everything, like a lot of these are about get brighter. We have to see the light. We have to shine your own light, make your own sunshine, like especially in the US. Like if you just Google anything, you're going to find all of these. And so I'm going to stop sharing this, but you can kind of keep it in your head, and you can choose the one that you like the best in terms of how to I don't know, just to see if we sort of live in the same world. So I don't even know where to go from here. I mean, like, if that's the world I live in, and if we live in a world that's sort of intolerant to darkness and just doesn't know what to do with it, like, on the one hand, it's really great. Like, let me just focus on one of those. Choose happy, right? Choose happy. All right. That sounds really good. Like, I would love to choose happy. I really love self-help books. So I have read a lot of them, and a lot of them say choose happy, like the recent ones, the old ones. I think that it's a Stoic message from the ancient Stoics, because their whole shtick was, you can be happy regardless of your circumstances. And you don't need, like Seneca says, change your attitude, not your surroundings. And my students in particularly like this, because it's like, nothing's going to get in your way. So we've got this Stoic kind of choose happy in our US culture, mixed with, like, curiously mixed with Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking. And so when the Stoics would say something like choose happy, they don't mean that you could change anything about your surroundings, right? Like, they really are like, that's not within your control. And it's very important that you realize that first, that you can only control your virtue. You can control what you put into the world. You cannot control how the world responds to you, etc. Then the Norman Vincent Peale part is, if you think positively, you are going to get what you want in the world. And so then I think, wow, what a crazy setup for Americans to think, not only can I choose happy, but like, I can also make my dreams come true. And when it's going well, it's great, right? Like, when it's going well, we say things like, oh, I changed my perspective. I just have a better outlook on it. Like, I'm so happy that I, whatever, I can see the light, I see things better, etc. And like, so we're fooled. So that's what I'm calling like the light metaphor, is when it goes well and all these things that sound great, the cheer people up, no bad days. Like, when it works, it's kind of fun, because then you really think that you have power. But then, like, we are also dark. We're also sad. We're also depressed. We're also anxious. So the 5 chapters of my book are anger, sadness, which I call dolor, because in the Spanish, I think it captures more than sadness, grief, depression, and anxiety. So I think, okay, what do we do then with make your own happiness or choose happy? What do we do with that side of us? We're not creatures that are all light. We can't always be happy. One of those little signs was be happy always. My kid's principal every day over the monitor, the loudspeaker says, make it a great day or not. The choice is yours. And I think, oh, okay. What's that? How is he going to feel as soon as he has a bad day? Right? Then you've already failed. So I needed to write this book for me, and also for everyone else who has bad days and who lives with anxiety and depression and just other things that they don't belong on this scene at all. They don't fit in. And it makes you feel like a failure, because if the messaging is that you can make yourself happy and you fail to do it, then it's on you. And some of the books, like some of those self-help books, actually say, if you're not happy, it's on you. And that shows that the light metaphor is on one side when things are going well, and I'm calling it the brokenness story when things don't go well, because it's the same messaging. You can make yourself happy. Oh, what are you sniveling about? Why are you having a pity party? Why are you wallowing? And we say these things to ourselves, not just that other people say them to us, but we say these things to ourselves. And so we get the feeling, a lot of us, certainly my students tell me that they're broken. They're all anxious and they just say, I have a broken brain. I'm broken inside. They love that word. And I think a lot of people love that word. In 2019, there was a song called Broken and Beautiful by Kelly Clarkson. So it's like a word that goes around our society. And I aim to kind of try to get us not to use that word for ourselves, because it has all these connotations that don't really allow us to have dignity in darkness. And that's what I would like to give us with the book.
Well, I mean, one thing that we really get out of the cave image is the idea that faced with darkness, our goal is to escape and not to look at it, not to try to really take it in. And one thing I really love about your book is that the chapters really are attentive to difficult things, both it kind of philosophically and in your own life. So, I mean, we could maybe start with the chapter on anger, where you talk about parenting in a way that I think many parents will resonate with and appreciate the frankness of being open about the difficulties and the kind of fury and frustration of parenting. But you also provide a kind of wider context, drawing on philosophers like María Lugones, that pays attention to the complexity of anger and what we can learn from it. So could you can either start, it's kind of up to you, you can either start by talking about the frustrations of parenting, or about the kind of philosophical richness of anger as a lens onto the world.
I could do it through the story. So, I mean, I am angry like every day. I'm sort of dispositionally angry. And so it was not hard to write about anger, but it was hard to make peace with anger, because I always assumed that it meant that I was a monster. I yell at my kids, like I treat people bad sometimes, like I just feel like anger is bad. That's how I felt, right? And so during COVID, I decided to homeschool my kids, not just do the Zoom classing, but actually take them out of school. So they were completely my responsibility, for half the day, and then they would take a little rest, and then my spouse would take over. But that was a lot of responsibility. Plus I was writing this book. And so I wanted everything to go perfectly. And when it didn't, I would just get really upset, right? And I'd have to take these timeouts. And the time that I write about is just my kids it was like lunchtime, and they were fighting over who gets what almonds. They were like 6 and 8, fighting over almonds. And so I just like pitched them. I like threw one kid his almonds and the other kid his almonds. And then I was like, okay, I gotta go. So I had to go into my room again after like throwing almonds at my kids out of anger, because I was just like, who cares about the almonds, But then I started like being a philosopher, like I just think through my sources, right? So I think of Plato, and Plato says, like the passions, you're like a dark horse run amok. And I was like, yeah, pretty much sums it up. Like I look in the mirror, I look ugly, right? So Plato gave me ugly. The Stoics gave me irrational, like that anger, you can decide how you feel. Like, so the Stoics, people are talking in the chat already about CBT. It definitely has a link. It's been sort of written about a lot. We can talk about that later. There's definitely the notion that you can control your feelings in the Stoics, not just your thoughts, but you can actually stop yourself from getting angry. And so if you've ever said to yourself, I'm sorry I got upset, I'm sorry I got angry, that is Stoic, because they think you could even stop that feeling with practice. So that made me feel just completely irrational and out of control. And then I had Aristotle, who was the nicest by far, I think, of the philosophers on this stuff. And Aristotle said, you know what, it's okay to get angry. Like feelings are feelings. You can't really totally control them, or like it just takes way too long. You don't need to control them. What Aristotle said was you need to control your behavior. And so if you've ever said something like, I'm sorry, I yelled at you out of anger, that's Aristotle. And those are different, right? And so Aristotle was nicer to me, because he's like, at least your anger isn't wrong, but like you shouldn't be throwing almonds at your kids. But I kind of just got sick of all of them. And I was like, why can't anyone, I don't know, I guess make me just understand this better. And so I had, already sort of thought about Audre Lorde and bell hooks and María Lugones. And I was like, let me dig into them again and see what they have for me. And it's like completely different. With Audre Lorde, she says, anger's information. Listen to it. And she says, anger's a tool with which you can excavate honesty, right? So it's not a knee-jerk reaction against anger, like it's poison that you have to get rid of or eliminate. It's, there's something here, something's going on. And instead of saying, there's something wrong with me for getting angry, she helped me say, there's just something wrong. And even that split, just cutting off the last two words, had a profound effect on me. And María Lugones just opened my mind to the idea that there's a lot of different angers, and we kind of lump them all together, but they're all different. And so it would be helpful in the future if we could talk about the different kinds of anger that we have. She also calls certain kinds of anger self-care. And I was like, I've never heard of anger as self-care, you know. She also says that what was it? Anger's useful, anger is self-care. There's many kinds of anger. There's one other bit that I'm forgetting, but she just, clear-headed. She says, you know how like the stereotype of anger is that you're the most irrational when you're angry. And so I shouldn't say those things until I calm down. What happened to me was as soon as I calmed down, I'd say, oh, that was silly. That was nothing. No big deal. I was just getting, but then what happens is you didn't deal with it. Whatever it was that made you mad, you never dealt with it. So she said, you don't have to think of your anger as, like clouding your judgment. She says, I have seen women in the most like clear-headed when they're the most angry because, and the way that I think of it is because they have stopped caring what they look like. They stop watching themselves. They stop trying to look pretty while being angry, right? So much of this is gendered and, unladylike anger. I just had a student write about that. But Lugones is saying, no, you can be outrageously clear-headed because you are not caring what people, how they're going to see you or something like that, if they're going to think you're ugly. And so with those things, I started just to feel better about my anger. And I realized I'm not broken. I'm not a monster. I'm not a horrible mother. Like I'm really just burned out. And the difference is between thinking something's wrong on the inside and something's wrong on the outside. And so what I did was just assess how many things am I doing every day? Is the work equally distributed between me and my partner? Are my in-laws, although they're here, are they like helping? Is there any way that I could get them to help? Right. So listening to the anger helped me understand that I needed help. And that's where I want to stop, because whether or not you get the help doesn't change whether or not you should listen to anger. And so with these women of color, I call them like my trio, like with them, I'm like, okay, listen to it. It's information, not something to be judged like by default. Your anger's wrong. Maybe it's not good. Maybe you expressed it badly, whatever. Like I'm not saying it's virtuous necessarily either, but I like information because it makes it kind of neutral. And we've had this historical block against it, like it's poison. And so I just want to say, let's not default to anger's poison. Let's default to anger's information and try to listen to it more.
No, I love that. I mean, it kind of resonates with something you say in the chapter on suffering that seems profoundly right to me, where you talk about expressing pain as a way of being open to love, open to other people. And that maybe connects with the idea of being able to express anger can be a kind of openness to help, an openness to making change. So could you say something about that experience, which seems in a way runs through my experience reading your book, is that the incredible solace of someone expressing openly difficult emotions that is so powerful as a reader, because it feels like a kind of invitation to intimacy. Like why is it that these moments can seem so profoundly connective?
So Miguel de Unamuno is like my hero from the chapter on Dolor. That's another reason I use the Spanish, but yeah, he thinks we've got pain all kind of, that we're missing the point on pain. And so it's not our fault. We've been taught several things that may be shadows. One is that our pain is a burden on others. So if you think to yourself, have I ever hidden my pain from someone else because I thought it was going to make them sad? That's very common. Like if that's you, that's what we are generally taught. Another one is our job is to cheer each other up. And so if someone's sad, and this comes for me from the Epicureans, if someone's sad, you counter their negativity with your positivity. And so one of these graphics on my little slideshow was cheer someone up, right? Like bring them up. They're low, bring them up. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of that, like, isn't that annoying? Because it sort of just sounds like someone just doesn't want you to be sad. And it would be more convenient for them if you were just not sad. And that really gets at the heart of the chapter of like, what are we doing? And so I'd like to tell the story of Jody, if you don't mind, Kieran.
Yeah, no, please do.
It's a cool story and a lot of people like it. So Jody is a woman who has been out of work for 10 years and she wants to go back in the workforce. So she's talking to her husband and kids at the dinner table about going back, and I don't know where to go, and she doesn't want to go back to where she used to work, etc. And then she's clearly kind of, worried about it, sad about it, whatever. And the husband, just being raised where we're raised, is like, no, you can't talk like that. You're going to do great. You're such a great mom. You have so many skills, right? So he's just doing what we've been taught to do, which is like pump her up with positivity and get her to be confident, and he could even say, well, with that attitude, you're never going to get a job, right? That sort of thing is like commonplace, that in order to succeed, you have to believe you're going to succeed, like from the get-go. And so she kind of comes back and she's like, no, I just don't think so. Who would want to hire me? I'm so old and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, you just have to think positive and let me brainstorm. So he's all into brainstorming, right? Like, let's write things down. Let's go through the classified ads, And so the scene sort of ends. And this was presented in a book written by Martin Seligman, the founder of positive psychology, which is like enormous in the United States. And his book is called Learned Optimism, and it argues that we can teach our kids to be pessimists or optimists. So this is an example of how Jody is teaching her kids who are watching this to be pessimists. Okay, so he calls Jody a brooding pessimist who has a bad explanatory style. And he applauds the husband for being positive and being supportive and, all that kind of thing. And I read the story and I was like, oh my God, this husband's not listening at all to her. He's not listening at all. He's just countering her, right? Anything she says, no, you're wrong about that. You're right. So the idea in Seligman's mind is that she is explaining it badly and that he is explaining it better. And when I read it, I thought, oh, I think she's right. I think that a middle-aged woman who has been out of the workforce for 10 years is actually quite rational about her prospects of getting a job and how easy it's going to be to get a job. And I just thought, is Martin Seligman like, does he not live in our country? Does he not understand like the kinds of stuff that middle-aged women have to go through? Like, so it's pervasive how, if you've ever been told, well, you just like to be negative. That's a person who's just trying to like force you to be positive and you're not responding. But I want to put the lens back on the husband, and I just accuse him of being absolutely inept at dark moods. He has no idea how to handle her darkness, because let's say she's in a cave. I use that metaphor. So she's in her cave. She's in the dark. She's trying to reach them. So I picture her, she's trying to give him a string like the one Ariadne gave to Theseus to get out of the labyrinth, right? So it's this string and she's like, here I am, come find me. I'm sad. And he's like going in there with flashlights and he's like, let me make your day. Let's brainstorm together, right? He's like so inept and emotionally anemic that he can't reach her at all. So they're completely separate. So then I imagine the story at night. She wants to call her friend, but her friend's probably going to do the same thing. How could you think that about yourself, right? The next day, she now has to feel shame that she can't make herself happy for them. So either she's going to fake it, which we've all probably done. Oh yeah, I think it's going to go great. I'm fine. Or she's going to be like, making their breakfast and being like, yeah, I'm sorry, I can't feel better, right? She's just going to feel bad about not letting them cheer her up. Like, what's wrong with me that I can't be like more confident? Now I'm disappointing my family as well. So the whole focus is on her and everything she's doing wrong. But I want to put the focus on him and what he's doing wrong and how we're as a society teaching people the wrong thing. And so I bring in Unamuno, who had like lots of darkness in similar ways. And what he says made me think of rewriting the story, where if Jody were to say, I'm really worried about my job prospects, and the husband actually was present and he could just sit there in the dark with her and he could say, yeah, that sounds really hard. I'm sorry for you. Like, I'm sorry that this country is sexist in this way and that it's going to be a hard time. Right. And that he could ask her more questions and she could like express her loneliness and he could ask if she regrets it. Did you regret being with the kids? And she might say, no, I don't regret it, but I just wish that we lived, in Denmark or something where it's like, maybe better over there, right? And then he could have found her. He could have taken the string and he could have gone in there and found her. And so this sadness or dolor is a moment for connection. So when someone is sharing their pain with us, far from it being a burden, Unamuno sees it as a gift. And so I've started to see it that way. My pain and sharing my pain with other people, instead of thinking that I'm going to upset them or it's a burden on them, I want to think of it as, this is a chance. I'm giving you a chance to connect with me. Unamuno thinks we connect better when we're sad than when we're happy. Because when we're happy, sometimes you don't want to hear it. You're like, how are you? Good? Okay, good. But if someone brings you down, then you're like, oh no, I didn't, don't mess up my happiness. So he thinks that we connect better. We can see other suffering people, and they could have had a chance at a real connection at the dinner table. And so that's what I imagined for them in an alternative world where sort of Martin Seligman wasn't telling the story, but that if we could learn how to take each other's pain and how to give each other our pain and not see it as something that we're burdening other people with, I just think that our world would be just much nicer and kinder, and we'd feel less broken about ourselves.
There's a passage I kind of want to read, and maybe you could say a little bit about this. Unamuno takes this really far, and I find this passage very arresting and almost frightening, but I also love it. This is from a passage you quote in the book from his book, The Tragic Sense of Life, where he says, quote, "Reader, listen, though I do not know you, I love you so much that if I could hold you in my hands, I would open up your breast, and in your heart's core, I would make a wound, and into it I would rub vinegar and salt so that you might never again know peace, but would live in continual anguish and endless longing," which sounds in a way horrifying. And yet it's clear that the kind of, I'm not sure, maybe it is a kind of overstatement. I'm wondering how exactly to take it, but there's something that resonates with the idea you mentioned a moment ago, that kind of the sharing of suffering and being able to share suffering and being open to it is a kind of gift.
Yeah, I love that passage. I mean, he's always prone to sort of overstating, and he was always known for kind of going a little too far, but the point is there. I mean, he's squarely in a tradition of philosophers who want to wake us up, right? I think of Levinas, I think of the Gadfly, a lot of them don't want us asleep. And I think when we're comfortable, when everything's fine, then either we're in denial of the kind of underlying suffering that we are experiencing or that we could be experiencing, or we're not telling others, right? We have it, but we're just not letting them see it. And so he wants us to share pain. He wants us to be awake. The one I thought you were going to read was, he says, "When I have felt a pain, I have shouted it out publicly."
Yeah.
And I like that too. And I tell a story about my father in the ICU, and he was screaming. And the way my family coped with it, they said, "Oh, he's just being a big baby." Because I've gotten injections, I've gotten blood taken and I don't scream. And I said, "But you don't know what he's feeling. He's 85, right?" We tend to make other people, we tend to make ourselves feel better if we can just say that other people are exaggerating, rather than actually learning what it is to share pain with another person. And he taught me in the ICU, how to share and how you can be there for someone, because it didn't send me running out of the room. It actually sent me, I looked up, he was getting potassium in his hand. And apparently that's really, really, really painful. And my mom was kind of trying to say, "Oh, he's being a baby." And I said, "Mama, it's really painful." And you know what she did? She held his head instead of running away, right? Instead of pretending, we put a wall up and say, "It doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt you." But if we're "No, you're actually in pain," we're more tender, we're going to get more hurt, but that's not wrong. That's not the wrong way to be. The other way is kind of a denial or an insistence on the sunny side, to the point of ridiculousness, I think. And so there's just so much to be gained from sharing pain. But I also want to respect people's limits. The book is not a self-help book in that you should share more pain. I'm not telling people what to do. I'm saying that if you want to share your pain, you have many, many, many sources who will say that that's a beautiful gift to other people. So it's not a an imposition on you to share more pain. It's to say that there's many of us who would actually benefit from sharing. And so my father just died in February, and I emailed my whole department. Like, I went the other way. Normally people, especially academics, we hide it, right? And act like nothing's going on. And I'm like, no, something's going on. And I'm allowing you, I'm inviting you into my world. And the result was beautiful. People offered to teach my classes, and, just like notes, like it was very, very loving. And so you're giving people a chance to be there for you, even who maybe are not your closest friends. So there is something to be said for it. It's like, for me, just a very beautiful lesson from Unamuno.
Well, there is so much more in the book. Maybe Anthony can weigh in on whether we should turn to Q&A right now. The other figure that I had never known of that you introduced me to was Gloria Anzaldúa in the chapter on depression. Maybe if you could briefly tell us something about that, just because I think it's such an incredible narrative, and then we'll open things out to the audience.
Yeah, thank you. Anzaldúa, yeah, I want her everywhere. So Anzaldúa is from here, and she is one of the people who I think would have gotten into philosophy had philosophy been more open to people like her. So she called philosophy the most closed of male sanctums. But she took 2 philosophy classes in undergrad. She went to Indiana. She took 2 more classes. Like, she was clearly interested. She used the word philosophy a lot, and people call her a theorist or a thinker. And I just go out, even in my academic work, and I call her a philosopher, and I try to put her in the line of existentialists like Frantz Fanon and others. So I consider her to be an existentialist philosopher. So she also lived with depression and diabetes. So she had kind of 2 things that she was sort of dealing with at the same time. And she wrote Borderlands, which is her biggest book, although her thought matures, later too, in 1987. And 87 is when Prozac came out. So she was kind of at the beginning of when people were talking about it, depression as this chemical imbalance, serotonin deficiency, all that language, illness, mental illness. So she didn't really talk about that a lot, like in her correspondence, in her writing. She just used a different metaphor. And I'm using her example because I think it's really interesting. And I would like to add more metaphors for depression alongside mental illness, deficiency, condition, all the things that don't make us look or feel dignified. And so her metaphor, she's going all the way back to the Aztec philosophy. And the mother goddess is called Coatlicue. And this woman has two snakes for heads and is made of stone. And so when she would go into a depressive episode, she's like, okay, I'm going into the arms of Coatlicue. And she hated it, right? She said she was kicking and screaming. It was cold and hard and terrible. And she was not romanticizing depression in the least. But for her, she needed to make it part of her life. And in the end, like a few years later, she made it into part of her, she wrote an essay where she talked about 7 stages of conocimiento. Conocimiento is a kind of knowing, like a deep knowing and learning. And so depression, or the Coatlicue state, was one of the stages that she had to go through to end at conocimiento. And the important thing to say about this chapter is not that she was prescribing it for everyone. She was not saying that you need to lean into your depression or anything like that. And I certainly do not want to be misunderstood as saying, do you remember that book, Plato, Not Prozac?
Yeah.
So that's from the 80s. And I just think my book could be retitled like Plato and Prozac. Like there does not have to be a conflict between philosophy and Western medicines. But what I like about Anzaldúa, what she's doing is she's giving it a new name, a new color, a new idea, a new way to talk about it, so that she did not have to feel disordered. She didn't have to feel broken. She was like, yeah, this is part of me. She says it gave her new eyes. She always had the serpent like metaphor going on. So she always had like new serpent eyes every time she would go through a depression. So I think it's things like that we can use and maybe use our own metaphors, but populate alongside mental illness, right? We can also populate it with other metaphors.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So I think there are questions from the audience, and Anthony is going to moderate them. So maybe he can return and give us the Q&A.
Thank you. I'll certainly do so. And thanks to you both so much for that wonderful conversation. It's fair to say that the questions are literally well, not literally, but they are pouring in. So I thought I'd just start with to bring a few questions together, Mariana, that a couple of people have linked what you're talking about with two different things. So Tony and Vanessa want to ask about the parallels between positive, say toxic positivity and neoliberal stroke capitalist point of view. And an anonymous attendee asks whether the kind of structures that make up the toxic positivity, such as they list the myth of American exceptionalism, the idea of individual freedom, and the denial of dark feelings, make Americans, or presumably it could be extended to any country that endorses those values, more susceptible to authoritarianism. So I was hoping you could say something about the link between A, capitalism and neoliberalism, and B, like authoritarianism in relation to what you're saying.
Yes. Like, I want to find the people who make the shirts that say #NoBadDays. That's who I want to kind of talk to, because I think all these things are money makers, right? We sell it. And so I don't want to blame individuals. I certainly don't even want to blame ourselves for being inept. So there's two audiences I'm talking to. One is like us who feel those dark moods and feel like our world doesn't accept us or cannot tolerate us. But then also like when we've been the person who kind of fumbles a consolation, right? And like I did this with my students during grief, and each one was like, oh my God, like I said the wrong thing. Everyone thinks back to what they did. And so, but human beings, I don't really want to like fault, because we've been taught badly. That's what I think. And so naturally we've made mistakes, and we can go on to sort of, rethink all these things. So what I really want to find are these like machines, right? What are the machines that are churning out this stuff? Why in my airport, like, do I see a sign that says it will get brighter? I did not ask for that. Like, I did not ask to see that. I don't want to see that, because then it makes me feel bad. Well, who's making the posters that say keep calm and carry on? Because that makes me more anxious than anything. Why does that poster have to be right there? What's worrisome? So I feel like, yeah, it's definitely more on the lines of capitalism, like what's going on there. Like, how can we get people to sort of stop benefiting off of our perceived brokenness? And then with the other one, I was just thinking that Seneca would roll in his grave if he knew that we were sort of using his philosophy, but merging it with Peele's power of positive thinking. Because again, within the Stoic framework, as long as you're just changing yourself, right? Like we don't have that profound an effect on our world. But now if you stretch outward, we're like Stoic, like on steroids, because now we're saying, oh, and I can also make all my dreams come true. So it's the American dream meets Stoicism. I can control the inside and the outside, and I can manifest my dreams. That really is, problematic. I don't know what to say about authoritarianism, but I know that it's that confluence that I find particularly American and very, very disturbing. One without the other is sort of bad enough, but you put them together and we become invincible. And the opposite of invincibility is that we're broken, right? As soon as we tried to manifest something and it didn't work, then we only have ourselves to blame.
Thank you, Mariana. Kieran, would you like to come in on any aspect of those?
No, I found that really illuminating, and I one of the moments I really liked in the Gloria Anzaldúa chapter is a point where, reflecting on depression, sort of introspecting, she ends up tracing it to a racist, sexist society. Like she's not. This is sort of part of what fighting the brokenness metaphor does, is sort of resist a kind of individualistic self-help treatment for depression, and open up the possibility of saying there's a critique of society implicit in this. Like I think the phrase you use in that chapter, or maybe it's a phrase from her, is spiritual activism. And there's something like, if I could do spiritual activism, I would feel like I was sort of meeting that would be a description for how the kind of philosophy you're doing and that I would like to do sort of connects with these larger social challenges. While being personal in a way that your writing and hers definitely are.
Thank you. So there's a question here from Alice, who asks or says, thank you so much for this. My question, how do you distinguish grief from sadness from depression in the 3 chapters? They're all linked, but I'd be interested to know where you see the key conceptual distinctions to be.
Yeah, okay. So sadness was the trickiest one to deal with, because when I would kind of shop out the chapter, people would say, but isn't Jody just anxious? You know, and I thought, well, sort of, yes, but are these moods very distinguishable from one another? Right? She's anxious, but she's also lonely and she's sad. And so that's why Lorde captures it. I think of like Lorde, or the 2nd chapter, is the catch-all for the whole book. Like, this is like when you're down, right? Like, just kind of a generic sadness. And there's some cool stuff written about how sadness has been sort of overtaken by depression. And so then we don't respect sadness by itself a lot. Like, we kind of assume the worst, but we still have ordinary cases of sadness. So that's one. Grief, I mean, I'm trying to keep it at, you know, the death of someone. And in that chapter, we talk about like, because grief is falling into depression in terms of the DSM, and there's like fewer and fewer distinctions made, because if grief presents like depression, people are like, we might as well just, you know, treat it like depression, which has some merit, but some drawbacks. But there's already like people kind of talking against that, and wanting to keep grief as like it's the mood that is least pathologized, like in terms of like, people do not want grief. Like, I would say most of the people I read are like, grief is normal, like grief is not a pathology. But, you know, I understand the other argument too, which is that if you're suffering that much, what's the difference? Like, why do you get like a get out of jail free card because someone died in your life, and that other poor person, they don't have an excuse to be, you know, depressed or something? So it's problematic on a lot of fronts. I forgot what the other one was. What was the other one that was similar?
The 3 was sadness, grief, and depression. So I think
Yeah,
you've
okay,
covered
good.
it was just
But I
because,
wanted, yeah. One other thing that was really hard was picking the word mood, because I'm not that careful of a philosopher in terms of like, I didn't want it to be like a philosophy of the emotions, or like describe what an emotion is. I didn't want to get taken on that road. But I wanted to talk about like moods, and I knew that I wanted to put them all together. And so I just used the word mood. We don't have to use that word, because I would say feelings, and then like, depression's not a feeling. And I'm like, okay, I get it. Depression's not a feeling, but like, can we like hold off on what we're calling them, just to put them all in the same book? Because I think they have something in common. So mood like seems to do the work for me, but even all the like language was hard, like picking the right language that wouldn't really bother people, or get them to not even want to read it because they thought my language was wrong or something.
thank you. Kieran, on related to the question about sort of sadness, grief, depression, what were the sort of key moods or attunements that you focused on in your book, Life is Hard?
Well, I mean, I have a chapter on grief. I also talk about physical suffering. And I think actually Mariana's chapter on dolor, I mean, and also the story of Gloria Anzaldúa involve kind of the lines between physical and emotional suffering are very blurry. I mean, what comes to mind for me in response to that question is this comedian Drew Michael has a bit where he's talking about his own experience of depression and how people just think he's sad. And he says, you know, there's a crucial distinction between sadness and depression. Sadness is when something bad happens and you feel sad about it. Depression is a condition where you see things for what they are. And you know, it's kind of a joke about the idea of depressive realism, but I do think that there's a kind of insight, a kind of at least the sense of insight, the sense of opening out of things, and that maybe moods that as Mariana was suggesting, the idea of a mood is something more global than a localized emotional response. And I think those nuances do sort of come out in the chapters of her book. And I, you know, that in a way I wanted to write about depression, but obliquely through the particular, some of the kinds of things that can cause it, like loneliness or the kind of frustration at the injustice of the world. And yeah, depression as such, I think, is very hard to write about. And I think that's part of what I loved about Mariana's book was the ability to do that through, I think, this sort of very powerful case study of Anzaldúa.
Thank you, Kieran. That was a lovely answer. So we're very much approaching the end. So I'm going to combine two quite large questions, and we can just see where we go. So one's from David, who asks, is it possible to go too far in giving dark moods their due? Is there possibly a danger here of romanticizing pain and suffering? And the second one, which I take to be slightly linked, is from, wait, is it another David? Yes, it's another David, this time David Solomon. Is it better to remain in a dark place so that we can understand the darkness better and be better able to understand it and find a better way to leave it? Or is the dark place truer in itself? So those have some links. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on either or both of them, Mariana.
Yeah, it's very easy to imagine swinging on the pendulum, right? Like I write somewhere that I don't want to say that dark is the new light and we should all just go in the cave and stay there forever. I'm hoping, like, I think that even the dichotomy between light and dark is going to be old very soon. And I think that my book is like a moment that we need to be in to kind of put the world like right side up again, or maybe for the first time, like if the world is so heavy on light, I want to kind of put it the other way, just to say, but I don't want to like live there. I don't think we need to live in the dark any more than living in the light. I think that people who say, let's have a candlelight, Anzaldúa loved moonlight. That was her favorite, right? So it doesn't have to be like pitch black. The metaphor can be thrown away once we kind of shift a bit and become more tolerant of the moods. The idea isn't to romanticize these dark moods or live there or whatever. That's all been done before. But it's to kind of move past it into, you know, in the Wall Street Journal, they did a review of the book into color. And I like that, different colors, right? Let's add lots of metaphors. Let's add lots of colors. It's not just a replacement of light with dark. So I mean for the book to be obsolete in that way.
Thank you, Kieran. Do you have any reflections on that question, or those two questions?
I can't top wanting the book to be obsolete. I think that's a very beautiful final line.